In this presentation, I would like to take a look at the service for this recoil starter that is used on the Honda GC series. Now, it's important to realize that the GC 160 and the 190, I believe their starters will actually swap and fit each other, but the 190 is marginally taller. It's just something I've noticed working on these engines. I assume that's for better cooling flow or something of that sort. So just be aware of that. The other thing to be aware of is the rather tight spring tension, if you will, on this. So don't be bashful about winding the spring. There are a few tricks I want to show you about rewinding the string, or rather the spring, should the string, say that 3 times fast, break. Exactly how you do that so that you don't cause any damage to the starter. So before we hop into this, let's go ahead and take a look at some expectations. The expectations for this lab are outlined as follows. You need to perform a complete teardown and reassembly of this recoil starter unit. Yours may be a different color, doesn't really particularly matter. The instructions in this video tutorial are the ones that you should follow. I also have a lab sheet that I will provide if you would prefer a written copy of that. Signatures are required at various points, various stopping points within the lab. If you choose to work beyond those without getting those signatures, I will not be able to back sign those. So for example, if the starter is completely assembled and I never signed off for it being disassembled, it's really difficult for me to know if you actually took that starter apart. So make sure you're getting the appropriate signatures at the appropriate time. So the starter must not bind when it is correctly reassembled. You notice just factory fresh. I've never taken this particular one apart. It is smooth and consistent throughout its operation, and it should not have any hesitation when taking up any, or rather the last little bit of rope. If it does, you probably did not wind the spring according to the instructions in this tutorial, or if you are replacing the rope with aftermarket rope, you perhaps have a little bit too much wound up in there. In that case, all you got to do is simply trim that rope down a little bit. It is very important to understand that as a student, you are not permitted to trim the rope on this starter. Why would you trim the rope when it had a certain length from the factory? You took it apart and now it needs a haircut in the rope department. That doesn't quite make sense. That's a workmanship flaw that you will need to address. So no rope trimming on the school issued engines. With that being said, just to re-emphasize one more time, if you are replacing this on a live engine, like for a customer, you may need to trim a little bit of the rope if you're spooling it off a bulk roll or something like that. But that's a little bit more in depth than what we're going to look at in this particular presentation. Let's go ahead and get started with the starter rebuild. So let's go ahead and take a look at this starter. Let's go ahead and do the simple rope replacement first. So if your rope is a little bit frayed, and that's pretty obvious by visual inspection as far as that's concerned, what you're going to do is you're going to pull the rope all the way out of the starter. Okay, and I'm just using my thumb here to support and hold the spool. Then I'm going to grab this little knot tail and pull the rope back through the starter toward the spool. I can then release tension, and you can see that I have the rope here in my hands that I can play with. It's not fighting me. I'm simply going to undo. It's literally just a simple knot on the end of that. We'll undo it, straighten the rope out, and you can then grasp the starter handle and just pull the rope completely through the basket. Okay? You can then allow the spring to unwind. All right, we'll set this aside for later. At this point in time, you have the length of rope that you need. You can measure it. You can take a sample of it to the hardware store, whatever. To remove this end, I usually just insert a small screwdriver, pry that up, and pull it through the handle. If you're doing this as part of the lab for the classroom, please do not untie this knot. Most people don't get how to tie this knot back in. So it's kind of a simple knot, just with an extra little loop on it. I usually tie like 3 simple knots and it's ready to go. So let's say that you went to the hardware store and you purchased this whatever length of rope. So you tie a knot in the end of it, whatever that you brought home, and then the easiest way really is, see how we're fighting the curlicue, is to simply take a lighter, heat the end of the rope up a little bit, and that helps it to straighten out. Now we've also burned the end of that so that it's not fraying or anything like that. But to have that straightened out makes your life monumentally easier. We're simply going to thread it back into the starter handle. Okay, just like that. We're going to tuck the tail down inside like this. Give it a tug so that it's nice. Nothing's hitting my palm. You might even tuck this down inside the handle a little bit better than where it's at currently. So that looks like super neat and professional. All right, so the rope is now ready to be reinstalled back into the starter. So holding the starter like this, you will notice that if I rotate the basket, the spool, in the counterclockwise direction, okay, like I'm pulling rope out of the spool. So the little grommet where the handle goes is located here. I want to take note that one of these little reinforcements here has a hole drilled through it. Only one. It's not done on both sides, unfortunately. So I'm simply going to put a little scratch in the plastic, okay, to denote that, hey, that's the one that I'm talking about. We're simply going to take our finger and we're going to wind in the counterclockwise direction until the spring stops, okay? So it is completely wound. Now the problem is, if we thread the rope all the way around to our target spot, somebody can pull the rope excessively far out of the starter and break the spring. So that's no good. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to back this off about half of a turn until our area of interest lines up with the grommet, okay? And that means that when somebody pulls the rope all the way out of the starter, they're not going to damage the spring, all right? So the next thing that we have to do is we have to ensure that we thread the rope through the grommet and underneath this little red piece of plastic here. A lot of kids, when they rebuild this, they'll thread it over and into the spool. You can't do that. So here's what that looks like. Hopefully you can see. We're going to straighten the end of the rope out, thread it through, twist it such that the tail of the string is going over toward the spool. And then we're going to use our thumb to help guide that rope into the spool. And you can see the tail coming out of the spool on this end, and I just pushed it back through, unfortunately. So maybe we'll get a little bit more of that going. Be nice to have a different pair of pliers than what we have here, but we'll get it done. Maybe we don't need pliers. So once I've got that through the spool, I'm going to go ahead and pull the rope all the way through, release the spool, and simply tie, a simple knot, just like that, okay? Then I pull the handle, and I'll tuck that little knot tail in, so it's super nice. And there we have no binding, anything like that. We have re-roped the starter. Now let's assume here that something is broken inside and we would like to take it apart, because Honda does sell parts for this starter. How do we go about the disassembly process? It actually starts the exact same way as if we were going to re-rope the starter. So we'll go ahead, take our simple little screwdriver, pull that guy through, release. This is the same thing we've already done. We're going to just set this rope off to the side. We're going to release the tension. Okay, so at this point, the starter spool is kind of jiggly. It's got no spring tension on it whatsoever. What you need to do now is take your T25, it's a Torx 25, and this is backwards. So it's lefty-tighty, righty-loosey. So we're gonna pretend that we're tightening this fastener. We're pretending that we're tightening it, but we're actually loosening it. If you go the other way, you're just gonna strip the plastic out. It happens kind of a lot. It's done backwards like that, so that as you pull on the rope, it tightens instead of trying to loosen this fastener. There is a fair bit of resistance on it, almost like it's got, thread locker or something on it. I'm gonna hold all of this stuff down, remove the fastener, okay? The next part that gets removed is this little friction ring. At least that's what I call it. Now, its job is actually to pull out these little pawls or dogs, whatever you wish to call them. That's what this thing's job is. To keep friction steady on it, if you will, there is a spring located underneath it as well. So that simply is gonna be removed at this time. I see there's a little bit of plastic schmoo on that. So we're gonna set this little friction disc and the spring aside right now. Then we can take out these two. And this is typically what I notice in these starters that break, is the little tabs snap off of these little plastic. I think they're a couple of bucks. You can get them from Honda. I don't recall the part number right off my head, but we're gonna go ahead and remove those and set them aside for later. The next part here can be a little bit tricky because there's a spring that's still got tension wound up underneath the spool. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that it's really as neutral as possible, and here's where your safety glasses come in rather helpful. But by neutral, I mean it's not bound up, okay? And we're simply going to lift that up, and hopefully everything goes well, because you can see that spring stuffed neatly underneath there where it's at, okay? Now Honda has put some grease, and you can see that here. It almost looks almost like a silicone grease, but pretty much just a plain Jane wheel bearing grease that they've applied on there. If there's any dirt or contamination in that area here, you're definitely going to want to clean all of that up with some sort of a solvent at this time. So I'm simply going to set the starter housing, if you will, off to the side. And let's focus on the spool with the spring in it. So the spring can only go in the spool one direction. You'll notice up here that there's a tab, and this tab only has room to face in this particular direction. So it's got a little pocket actually in it where that tab rests. So that is a direction we have to put this spring back in. The removal of it is more straightforward than you might think. To remove the spring, I simply hold it down with one thumb and kind of partition off portions of it here as we go. So it can be a little bit technical if you haven't done it before, but we're trying to avoid any tangles or anything like that in it. There is a grease on the spring, which may not be the best thing in the world, as it does attract dirt. So definitely, if we have a slow rewind starter, we'll want to clean the spring. That's usually what the issue is. So here's the spring, here's the spool ready for cleanup, and here's the basket or the housing, whichever you prefer to call it. This is the point where you will want to get an instructor signature. What we're going to do now is we're going to clean the spring. Be careful, because right here, about one revolution around, is a little tab that'll hook you. Kind of hurts your skin there a little bit. So I'm just going to take a rag here essentially and spin the spring around. We're going to make sure we're not getting any tangles in it. There we go. and we're going to wipe off whatever happens to be on it. I'm just going to go the whole length of the spring. I'm going to move the rag here as we go. So you can see it's getting some stuff taken care of. They put a grease of some sort on it. I'm not a big fan of that. We do need to put something on it to keep it from rusting, however. So we're just going to put essentially just a bicycle chain lube, real thin oil, some sort on that. So that's what we have removed from our brand new starter. Kind of nasty. There's the spring. We're going to go ahead and take some of this finish line, not a sponsor, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to put some on this rag and then simply draw the spring through it. Okay, and this will clean, and it will also prevent corrosion on the metal, which is really all we're trying to do here. We're going to do this literally exactly the same way as we did here before. We don't want too much oil on it, because again, it's just going to collect dust, which will then make the starter rather sticky after a while. In other words, you give it back to the customer, they'll mow a dusty yard with it, and then, hey, my rope doesn't pull back in all the way. It'll be back in your shop. So there you go. Okay, that spring is cleaned and lubricated. We are now ready to install it back into the spool. So I would put just a little bit of grease, if you will, in the bushing area here of the spool. I actually did not clean out the factory Honda lube. Part of your lab assignment is that you do that, but obviously for this one, we're going to be okay with that. So you'll get the idea on how to wipe it out with a rag. So if you're going to reapply just a tiny little bit in there, less is more. You want that to be able to slide about like that, just plastic to plastic, if you will. So you don't have to put a lot, because then it just ends up inside the basket like that. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and reinstall this. So what you want to do is you want to take your spool and take your spring with this end of the spring hanging out. Remember that little pocket up here where my finger is at? We're simply going to install the spring into that. All right, you can just literally drop it in from the top. And I'm going to put my thumb there to hold it, okay? And then I rotate the spool to wind. Now remember that little tab here that keeps hooking you and cutting your finger? There's actually a window, you'll see it when you put the spring back in, that kind of locks the two parts of the spring together. So this one's not real good, but you can kind of see it wanted to stay in. It's not going to hold it in all by itself, but it'll make your life a little bit easier. So here is that procedure here. We just keep going around. We're winding clockwise. We're turning the spool clockwise. And all we're doing is moving the spring from free space into the center of the spool. This takes a little tiny bit of practice as you go. I've done a few of these. So don't feel bad if it wants to grenade. It definitely likes to try to do that. Definitely encourage you to wear some safety glasses during this. In fact, during this lab, it is required. It's part of your safety grade, participation, employability, if we want to call it that. So we just keep doing that for a while until that spring is back in, and you can do it with just your fingers if you want. It takes a little bit more talent. There you go. And if you did it right, you're going to see that your spring stays inside of the spool. Now, this little tab here, I suggest bending it ever so slightly over to where it sits about 1/3 of the way in the through the opening. Okay. Now you're going to take your clean basket, and again, part of the lab is to service the grease on here, just a light wheel bearing grease. You're going to notice there's a slot. Okay, and this spring tab that's hanging out lines up with the slots. So you can actually turn the spool upside down and it just drops right down on there and everything's good. You want to make sure that it's set down all the way. If the spring pops out, the basket, or rather the spool, will sit up and it'll grind against the flywheel. It's not going to be any good. All right, so everything is good, nice and flush. The red is flush up with the black here in this area underneath. Kind of can't really see it, but you'll have to take my word for it. Next, we're going to install these little cams. There's no particular order. They only fit in one way. We don't need any grease. We're going to put this spring in here, and I'm just going to wipe it here with a little bit of that chain oil for your bicycle. What you need to do when you put this on, you notice there's a little pocket in here for the spring. And when you press this down, you need to be able to rotate it such that you can see the little cams actually working. A lot of times, folks will miss this little track that's inside of here. There's a groove for these little tabs to go, and then nothing works out correctly. So just test that, you know, right here. Make sure everything's good, and then while you're holding that down, go ahead and install the screw. Now, mind you, it's lefty-tighty, righty-loosey, so we're going to pretend that we're loosening this fastener up. And we should be able to tighten this guy most all the way, but you don't want to wrench it down because it will mushroom out, and then the starter's not going to work like at all. So that's where it just went snug, okay? And you can see everything moves. If it's tight, just back it off ever so slightly, a tiny little bit. The spool should be free to move in the starter. Our next step is simply going to be to grab this basket and wind counterclockwise as far as it goes. Don't force it, you'll break the spring. So it stopped, doesn't want to go anymore. Remember that little scratch that we left, which is here? It is not in the correct position, so we want to back that off a little tiny bit so that we cannot overextend the spring. We want to kind of get a trajectory going on. Hopefully you can see my screwdriver. There's like the perfect angle that you can get with the rope. So since we've already torched the end of this rope and we've already installed it into the handle, we should, theoretically, this is the tricky part, be able to get that guy installed just like that. Pull it all the way through, let go of the spool, retie your plain simple chain knot with maybe, I don't know, 10 millimeters worth of knot tail. Pull it through. I like to tuck the knot tail down inside so it looks a little cooler. I suppose you don't have to. Give it a tug, and there you go. Rope pulls all the way out, all the way in. And that is what I'm looking for on your starter rebuild lab. This has been a look at how to perform a rebuild of a starter on your Honda GC Series engine.